It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor, tremendous honor for me to be able to join you this evening out there in Illinois at Cantigny Park. Uh, Let me begin by giving you a quick introduction to myself. Like I say, like Laura says, I am the grandson of World War II veterans on both sides of the war, both the American and the Japanese side. My grandfather wore this pin on his uniform with the 442nd Infantry Regiment, uh, United States Army. And my uncle, my grandfather's brother, uh, he actually was born in Japan, raised in Hawaii, sent back to Japan in the late 30s, and was conscripted into the Japanese army and was serving in the Philippines in 1944, fighting against American Marines. And so I think from a personal perspective, the ability that I have to share the story of the end of World War II and the reconciliation between countries that are of my own blood is a tremendous honor and a tremendous privilege. But hopefully we'll be able to see all of that in tonight's presentation. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to go ahead and start my presentation here about the Battleship Missouri. So we'll start with our from beginning. There we go. All right. Strength for Freedom. Strength for Freedom is the USS Missouri's motto. It was actually written in Latin, vis ad libertatem, strength for freedom, and that's been our motto since 1944. Let me begin by talking about the association I work for, the USS Missouri Memorial Association, headquartered in Honolulu, Hawaii. Since 1998, have been the caretakers of the battleship USS Missouri BB-63. You see her bow there in that photograph, and there's little interesting words about that photograph. That photograph was actually taken on the 29th of January of this past year, 2020. And I'd been walking down on the pier. It was the anniversary of our launching, and I stuck my camera out over the water and decided to just take one quick picture, and that's what I got. So, the world works in mysterious ways some days, and this beautiful photograph is the one I got on the 29th of January of this past year. The USS Missouri Memorial Association is dedicated to preserving the Battleship Missouri and sharing her story and place in history. That's our mission statement for our organization, and everything we do on board the Battleship Missouri, it revolves around preserving the ship and sharing her story and place in history. And so that's why it's such an honor and such a privilege to be here with all of you tonight. So we'll begin by talking about the construction of the USS Missouri. And it was initially ordered in 1940 as a part of the Iowa class of battleships. There was a plan to build 6. They ended up only building 4, and the Battleship Missouri would be the last one completed. She'd be laid down on January 6th of 1941 at the New York Navy Yard in Brooklyn, and given hull number 63, meaning that she was the 63rd battleship to be constructed by the United States Navy. Construction would take 3 years and 23 days, with over 3 million man-hours of construction time. It was launched into the East River on the 29th of January, 1944, commissioned into our Navy on June 11th, 1944. It would be, like as I said, she'd be the last battleship completed by the United States Navy and the last active battleship in the entire world. Her career spans 3 wars and over 40 years. So let's take you back to the beginnings of the Battleship Missouri. And in this photograph that you see here from the Naval Historical Center, you'll see Rear Admiral Clark Woodward, the gentleman with the rivet gun there. He's driving the first rivet during the keel laying on the 6th of January in 1941. Next picture that we'll see here is engine install, circa 1942. You'll see the hull of the ships being completed, and they've actually started construction of the engine rooms. These actually are boilers, Babcock and Wilcox Type N boilers, and 4 steam turbine engines, which are capable of producing 220 12,000 forward horsepower, which translated to an effective top speed in excess of 25 knots, with a normal cruising speed of 15 to 18 knots. Battleship Missouri was huge and needed all of this power just to get her moving. She ran initially in 1944 on something called bunker fuel. Bunker fuel is that very thick, heavy black oil, the stuff that if you've ever been to Hawaii and seen the USS Arizona, that bunker fuel is that black oil that you still see bubbling up from the USS Arizona. That's what she ran on back in 1944. By 1986, the second time she comes back into service, Battleship Missouri is using something called DFM, diesel fuel marine type. It's a much more refined fuel, a much more cleaner burning fuel. But at both times, she carried about 2.5 million gallons of fuel. Now, this is January 29th of 1944. Battleship Missouri is nearing the end of the building ways along the East River. The Battleship Missouri was christened by a woman named Mary Margaret Truman. Margaret Truman was the daughter of Senator Harry S. Truman. He wasn't vice president yet. He wasn't president yet. He was just a senator from the state of Missouri. And at the launching, Truman was asked to speak, and he says, and I quote, "The time is surely coming when the people of Missouri can thrill with pride as the Missouri and her sister ships, with batteries blazing, sail into Tokyo Bay." And just think about how prophetic those words were, because in less than 2 years, the Battleship Missouri is sailing into Tokyo Bay, and there are several of her sisters with her into Tokyo Bay at the end of World War II. A little funny story, though, about the launching date. Funny story is that Mary Margaret Truman was the woman who had cracked the bottle of champagne over the bow of the ship. Now, that bottle of champagne needs to be prepared properly so that it shatters when it's struck against the bow. The way they do that is they'll take a diamond cutter and they'll cut scores into the bottle. It was a cold winter day and everybody was rushing around at the shipyard. And apparently they'd never scored the bottle properly. So Margaret Truman grabbed the large silver bottle of champagne, smashed it against the bow, and nothing happened. She smashed it again, and nothing happened. She smashed it a third time, and on the third try, it shattered and splashed all this champagne cascading down the bow, all over her and her fur coat, and all over Admiral Forrest Sherman, who was standing next to her on the platform. The Admiral had his full dress uniform on, and he was covered in this champagne, and he looked over at Margaret Truman and started to complain about the fact that he had champagne all over his uniform. And the sturdy Midwestern gal that Margaret Truman was looked over at the Admiral and said to him, "Don't complain, Admiral, because it got me too." She never got the smell of that champagne out of her coat. And she loved the fact that she was able to kind of tell off the Admiral there that morning on the 29th of January. Now we're looking at a photograph here of the basic specifications and an overhead shot and profile view of the Battleship Missouri. This is actually a poster that I have, and it gives you some of the specifications of our ship. 887 feet, 3 inches in length, 216 feet, 6 inches in height from keel to mast. At our widest point at the waterline, 108 feet, 2 inches. Drafting 38 feet, 11 inches under full load. In other words, that means that 38 feet, 11 inches of it is underwater, under full load with everything it needs for combat. Its full load displacement, its weight, 58,000 tons. And you'll see at the last two bullets there, its complement and its armament, you'll see that there are two different numbers, especially for its complement. Back in 1944, numbering 2,400 enlisted, 132 officers. Back in 1986, at the time of its second commissioning, Battleship Missouri numbered 1,250 enlisted and 65 officers. Main armament on board always stayed the same, 9 16-inch 50 caliber guns. And back in 1944, her secondary armament numbered 25-inch 38 caliber guns, and about 120, 20, and 40 millimeter Bofors anti-aircraft guns. Those would change in the 1980s as we developed new and more accurate weapon systems. World War II battles of the Battleship Missouri. She's commissioned in June of 44. She has shakedown and sea trials. She's seen 3 major campaigns. From February to March of 1945, Missouri would see action at the Battle of Iwo Jima, providing gunfire support for Allied and American forces. From March to July, she'd be off the coast of Okinawa. And during that time, she would provide naval artillery support and as well as be struck by a Japanese kamikaze in April of 1945. In all of July and August and early August 1945, the Missouri would bombard Japanese factories on the islands of Hokkaido and Honshu during the Home Islands campaign. So let's show you some of the photographs of these battles. These are interesting photographs and each one has a story. The first one, if you take a look on the left side of your screen there, you'll see Allied naval forces off the island of Iwo Jima. You'll see an American battleship, that is the USS Tennessee, if you can barely make it out, surrounded by some of the smaller craft in the left-hand picture. On the right-hand lower side of the screen, you'll see from the island of Iwo Jima, looking out into the water, into the sea, off of Iwo Jima, you'll notice the Higgins boats and the LSTs, this massive fleet coming ashore. And the Battleship Missouri's role at that time was to ensure that those landing crafts and those Marines and soldiers were able to make that amphibious landing at the island of Iwo Jima. Similarly, at Okinawa, we would do the same thing. The bottom right photograph there, you'll see the battleship in the foreground there. That's the USS Missouri, and you'll notice those little puffs of black smoke around her. That's all of that flak, that anti-aircraft fire fired off by Missouri, again, under attack during the Battle of Okinawa. Now that top left-hand photograph is a modified US M4 Sherman. Now that tank normally would fire a projectile, but it also had a secondary gun. And that secondary gun with this modification was converted from a projectile throwing gun into a flame throwing gun. Normally, you would have a Marine or a soldier with his flamethrower carrying about 2 to 3 gallons of jellied gasoline on his back and throwing flame about maybe 25 to 50 yards. Very vulnerable targets, those soldiers were. So they decided to give them a little bit more protection. They decided to give them a little bit more range, and they modified that smaller 40 caliber gun or 40 millimeter gun on the Sherman to hook up to a feed line of jellied gasoline or napalm. And you can see there, it increased the range tremendously to about 200 yards and gave the crews behind it a lot more protection thanks to the armor on the tanks. Now, this story that I'm going to tell you next is probably one of my favorite stories to tell. This is during the Battle of Okinawa, and it's April 11th of 1945. The Battleship Missouri is under attack by numerous waves of Japanese kamikaze. These are those planes with the sole intention of sinking Allied and American ships. We'd shot down 11 during the Battle of Okinawa, but the 12th one came on 11th of April, 1945 at about 2:43 in the afternoon, about a half hour from now, if today had been April 11th of 1945. Now, the photograph that you see in the top left-hand corner of your screen is a photograph taken by a baker, what we would call today a mess specialist, Buster Campbell. And Buster Campbell was during battle stations. His battle station was one of the 40 millimeter gun mounts on board ship. Rather than reach for that gun mount, he reached for a Graflex camera, a very large, unwieldy camera. He turned and snapped that picture. And you can see it is the only known photograph of the Japanese kamikaze on the Battleship Missouri in flight. You'll see it there in the upper left-hand corner of the photograph. Now, the interesting story about that photograph is it was taken and printed, submitted to the Associated Press, and it was entered into the Pulitzer Prize competition for photography that year. It didn't win. 1945, it didn't win. What did win was a photograph by Joe Rosenthal at the Battle of Iwo Jima as he photographed the raising of the flag on Mount Suribachi. What was the second place photograph? It was this one by ship's Baker second class, Buster Campbell. But upon impact, the Japanese plane would shear into two pieces. One half would fall into the ocean along with a 500-pound bomb that did not detonate. The other half would cartwheel on board ship, spread gasoline all over the aft end of the Battleship Missouri, and start a huge fire. The general quarters and damage control alarm sounds, and the crews of the Missouri would put the fire out in 3 minutes with no loss of American life. They would do their debris walk down, and they'd find the debris from the plane scattered all across the deck. And about 150 feet forward of the crash site, they would find the remains of the Japanese pilot. The captain of our ship, Captain Callahan, would order that an honorable burial at sea be given to the Japanese pilot. And you can see a photograph of that in the bottom right-hand corner. They would bury him at sea, and they would cover his body in a Japanese imperial war flag. Now that imperial flag, it was not taken from the Japanese pilot, it was made by the crew on board the Missouri. When crew members asked the captain, "Why are we giving honor to the Japanese pilot?" Captain Callahan responded by saying, "We're Americans, boys, and that's what we do." Captain Callahan had lost his brother, Daniel, at the Battle of Guadalcanal in 1942. So if there was anyone on board who understood loss and sacrifice, it was Captain Callahan. But Captain Callahan also recognized that there is an unspoken code amongst warriors, and he chose to honor that code in April of 1945. Following World War II, Battleship Missouri would see action in the Korean War, deploying twice in 1950 to 1953. Covered the evacuation of the Chosin Reservoir and marine landings at the port cities of Hongnam and Samcheok, and then was decommissioned from 1955 to 1984. In 1984, with a budget of $475 million, Missouri was returned to service in '86 with new weapons, electronics, and ready for modern Cold War service. But let's take a look at what she did in Korea. You'll see in the top left-hand corner, that's North Korea. You'll see American infantrymen crouching, watching the white puffs of smoke. That's white phosphorus that would have been fired off from either mortars or from the Battleship Missouri. And her job was to cover the landings and cover the advancement of these American infantrymen. Now, the photograph in the bottom right is off of a place called Chungcheon, North Korea, in October of 1952. And the interesting story behind this photograph was that the Navy took this photograph, sent it back to Washington, D.C., and the recruiting officers got a hold of it, and they decided to stylize it. And it became a recruiting poster for the United States Navy. It says, "Fight, join the Navy." And it was this photograph of the Battleship Missouri that served as the inspiration for that recruiting poster. And then in 1986, she comes back to service. And she will fight her third war. Now imagine, and I tell this to students all the time, imagine that you are a young Marine or a young soldier fighting in the Persian Gulf, and you had heard stories, and your relatives, your uncles, maybe your dad, had regaled you with stories of his time in World War II or in Korea, telling you all about this massive ship that rained fire down on your enemies. And when you asked him, "Uncle, what was the name of that ship?" And he said, "The Battleship Missouri." And you never really thought about it as you were growing up, but now here you are, 19 years old, serving in the Marines or in the Army in the Persian Gulf. and fighting against the Iraqis. And you look out at sea and you see a big gray ship with number 63 on the side. And you remember all the stories that your dad or your grandpa or your uncle had told you. Imagine what that must have felt like. By 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the crumbling of the Soviet Union, the Cold War was pretty much over. But the USS Missouri was poised for her final active duty wartime service in 1990 and 91 in the Persian Gulf. She was equipped with Tomahawk land attack missiles, Harpoon anti-ship missiles, close-in weapon systems, improved radar. And she was in the Gulf for 6 months, providing, again, naval artillery support for troops on the ground in Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Kuwait. So you can see over on the left-hand side there, February 6th of 1991, Battleship Missouri is firing off those big 16-inch guns again. Not a whole lot different from what she did in World War II, not a whole lot different from what she did in the Korean War. Those guns were still powerful. In fact, they were still the largest naval guns on board an American naval ship throughout her entire career. Now, if you take a look at the bottom right-hand photograph, that's a little different. Instead of firing off a 1,700 or 2,000-pound projectile, we're firing off a Tomahawk land attack missile. This is the first time that we're using it. This is early in mid-January of 1991. This photograph shows one of our Tomahawk land attack missiles being fired. We carried 32 on board, and during the Persian Gulf War, we would fire off 28 of the 32 Tomahawk missiles that we had on board. Following the Gulf War, Missouri's final operational deployment was for Operation Remembrance in December of 1991, here in Pearl Harbor, as the centerpiece of the 50th anniversary commemoration of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And during this time, we would have open houses, and we would welcome aboard President George H.W. Bush, a World War II veteran, and Chief of Staff Chairman, General Colin Powell. But within 4 months, on the 31st of March, 1992, the Battleship Missouri would be decommissioned for the second and final time, ending her service in 3 wars and spanning 40 years. And in 1998, the USS Missouri Memorial Association was named caretaker of Battleship Missouri. She arrived here at Pier Foxtrot 5 in Ford Island on the 21st of June. It was Father's Day, 1998. And I want to show you what it looked like when she was coming home. Battleship Missouri is underway, and the sailboats are alongside her in that top left-hand corner. You'll see the tow chain coming from her bow there. She was actually towed across the sea, 5-week tow, by a ocean-going tug called the Sea Victory. And every stop along the way, and every time along the way, there'd be personal watercraft that would come alongside, because the people knew that this ship was finally going home. In the bottom right-hand corner, you see more of those personal watercraft, sailboats, speedboats, jet skis. And this is one of my favorite photographs, because this reminds me of a day when I was 16 years old. And I was on that beach in the background with my father. My father's a 42-year Army veteran. And we're watching this battleship come home. And I looked up over at my dad and I said, "Dad, someday I want to tell the story of the Battleship Missouri." My dad, being a 42-year Army soldier, spent 2 lifetimes in the Army. He looked at me, he kind of laughed, and he says, "That's a Navy ship, isn't it, son?" And I said, "Yes, it is, Dad." He kind of laughed it off. I was 16, still in high school at the time, so we kind of laughed it off and never really talked about it much. But later on, I'll tell you the story of how I ended up at the Battleship Missouri. But let's talk about the most important things. The Missouri and the end of World War II. On the 6th of August, 1945, at 8:15 in the morning in Japan, the American B-29 Stratofortress bomber, the Enola Gay, opened its bomb bay doors and dropped the first atomic weapon in combat. The aim point was a unique T-shaped bridge traversing the intersection of the Honkawa and Motoyasu rivers in the city of Hiroshima. Ultimately, the bomb would miss its aim point by about 600 meters. It was codenamed Little Boy, and it detonated as planned, perfectly, at an altitude of about 1,200 feet to maximize destructive effect. The photograph that you see on the left is an aerial reconnaissance photo taken by the United States Army Air Corps. And this photo is courtesy of the Library of Congress. On the left there, you'll see the aim point. On the right is a similar photograph taken after. All of the white that you see in the right-hand photograph is all the destruction of that single bomb. 3 days after Hiroshima, Nagasaki was bombed much to the same effect. And 6 days after Nagasaki, on the 15th of August, Japan's emperor announces his intention to have Japan formally surrender. It sets off widespread celebration here in the States, amongst all the allied countries. And on board our ship, right here, the tone is celebratory, but it's muted because we know that we're still on deployment. And when order comes down, make way for Tokyo. We arrive on the 29th of August under escort by an American destroyer, the USS Nicholas, and a Japanese fishing trawler navigating amongst 255 other ships in Tokyo Bay proper and neighboring Sagami Bay. This photograph on the left shows thousands of American sailors climbing everywhere they could to just be a part of the September 2nd ceremony, just to see it. On the right side there, you'll see General Douglas MacArthur standing at the microphone with his allied officers behind him. Now you can barely see him, but he's in the foreground there. Is Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser, and I always love to talk about Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser. Sir Bruce Fraser was the representative from the United Kingdom. And you'll notice that most of the officers on board were wearing tropical uniforms. They were wearing khaki type uniforms, some with coats, some without. General MacArthur was without coat and without top button that day. But the only one amongst all of the allies there who was wearing knee-high socks and shorts was Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser of the British Royal Navy. Now, to be fair, that was his prescribed uniform for the area of operation, but it's a little bit, it always makes me laugh to know that our British brothers and sisters in World War II, their tropical uniform included shorts, knee-high socks, and white patent leather shoes. The ceremony is as you see it here. You'll see General Douglas MacArthur on the left, seated, signing the instrument of surrender. And General Wainwright and General Percival standing behind him. Jonathan Wainwright was captured at the fall of Corregidor in the Philippines by the Japanese, and General Percival captured at the fall of Singapore. Now, the first pen that MacArthur uses to sign a part of his name that morning would go to General Wainwright, because it is a promise that he has made to General Wainwright. In 1942, MacArthur is on the island of Luzon in the Philippines, and he retreats. He leaves the Philippines under command of General Wainwright, and he says, of course, I shall return. Wainwright can't hold the island, is captured and sent to a Japanese prisoner of war camp in Manchuria. But MacArthur never forgot his promise. And in 1945, he returns to Luzon. He walks onto the beach and he says to the Filipino people, I have returned. And so he never forgot his promise to the Filipinos, and that pen that went to Wainwright was symbolic of it. You'll notice in the photograph on the right-hand side, the Japanese delegation of 11 men, led by the foreign minister of Japan, with the cane there. His name is Mamoru Shigemitsu, the chief of staff of the Imperial Army, General Umezu, standing next to him. But the younger man, standing there with the top hat on the left shoulder of Umezu, that's Mr. Toshikazu Kase. Toshikazu Kase was an agent of the imperial household who spoke fluent English and was served as a translator. And he wrote a book called Journey to the Missouri, and in it he talks about his experiences as a Japanese on board the Battleship Missouri. And in that that book, I encourage all of you to read it if you have the opportunity. He talks about how Japan, and I quote, has traded her sword for a spade, and with that spade, she will cultivate a new hope for the world. Kase is an interesting character because he was not, he understood the power of Japan's surrender, and he needed to cooperate with the United States in the post-war years. Nearly 1,000 Allied and American warplanes flew over Tokyo at the conclusion of Japan's formal surrender. Note the USS Missouri in the foreground there. And each one of those flights, this is probably their second pass, maybe their third, but their first pass was at about mast height over the ship. And some of our veterans aboard who had been aboard that day said, we thought that it was actually gonna that it was actually going to strike the mast. It was so loud and so deafening. But what I'd like to do right now is I'd like to play for you I'm going to stop this share, and I'm going to actually take a screen share here, and I'm going to bring up a newsreel for you. And this newsreel is how the Americans would have gotten their news back in 1944 and 45 about Japan's surrender. So if you can, I'll play this for you.
U.S. Battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay was the setting for the signing of the surrender terms, which officially brought the war with Japan to an end. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allies, joined Admirals Nimitz and Halsey and other top commanders aboard the Missouri September 2nd, 1945. The ceremony took place on a Sunday. Foreign Minister Shigemitsu and other representatives of the Japanese nation on the deck of the battleship, even as the world recalled that other Sunday in '41 and the act of treachery which shattered the calm of the Pacific Ocean and the world. Now at last, defeated Japan and the Allies were to sign the surrender terms.
The terms and conditions upon which surrender of the Japanese imperial forces is here to be given and accepted are contained in the instrument of surrender now before you. As Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, I announce it my firm purpose, in the tradition of the countries I represent, to proceed in the discharge of my responsibilities with justice and tolerance, while taking all necessary dispositions to ensure that the terms of surrender are fully, promptly, and faithfully complied with.
First to sign the surrender document was Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu for Japan's Emperor. Articles in the surrender terms included the following. All provisions of the Potsdam Declaration were accepted. All armed forces were surrendered unconditionally. Acknowledgement that authority of the Emperor and the Japanese government was subject to the will of the Allied Supreme Commander, General Douglas MacArthur, now signing. The first pen became a cherished memento for General Wainwright. The second pen went to Britain's General Percival. In order, the nation signed. General Su Yung Chang for China. For the United Kingdom, Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser. General General MacArthur called on the representative of the Soviet Union, Lieutenant General Kuzuma N. Derevyanko. Also, the representative of Canada, Colonel L. Moore Cosgrove. In all, there were 12 signatures affixed to the surrender document, and then in 20 minutes it was over. Nearly 4 years of bitter conflict had come to this brief ceremony. The war chapter was closed, and a weary world looked hopefully to new horizons of enduring peace.
All right. Now, I'm going to share one more here. As I said, the ceremony to end World War II began at 9:02 on Sunday, September 2nd of 1945, and within 23 minutes, it was over. The ceremony began with the remarks, as you heard. He says, the issues involving divergent ideals and ideologies have been determined on the battlefields of the world, and hence are not for our discussion or debate. Nor is it for us here to meet, representing as we do a majority of the peoples of the earth in a spirit of distrust, malice, or hatred. He goes on to say, rather, it is for us, both the victors and vanquished, to rise to that higher dignity which alone befits the sacred purposes we are about to serve. In short, MacArthur had no intentions of placing blame on the Japanese. He viewed the ceremony as a conduit to future reconciliation between the nation. And that's evidenced in keeping in how he shows that he keeps the emperor in power. He knows that he has full authority in Japan, but he keeps the emperor in power because it will help to placate the people of Japan, and it will help to ensure that what he wants to get done in Japan for the benefit of Japan and the United States are, as he says, fully, faithfully, and promptly complied with. Today, the Arizona Memorial and the USS Missouri sleep peacefully together in Pearl Harbor, where World War II began for the United States. Known across the world as the bookends of World War II, the two memorials share the story of the entirety of World War II. The Missouri Memorial Association is dedicated to preserving the Battleship Missouri and sharing her story and place in history. Thank you very, very much. And now I will stop my share and I'll call on Laura. We can do some.
There we go.
We can do some Q&A with you if you want to.
Perfect. Well, I know we don't have an audience here, so I always like to give a good round of applause. Thank you so much for that great presentation. Let's go ahead and get to some questions. We do have some to get us started. Again, please use that Q&A feature button at the bottom of your screen. We will not be using the hand raised feature this evening. So that is the best way to get questions over to me. I will do my best to get to as many questions as possible. So let's get started. Our first question here is, so the USS Missouri was one of the last battleships. What replaced it? Do you have anything you can share with us on what the Navy is now using instead of those types of battleships?
So basically, at the time of World War II, there was the capital ship was the battleship. In other words, and it was the tip of the spear to take something from our special forces brethren. It was the tip of the spear. In terms of naval warfare. But once December 7th happens, we realize that battleships are not what they used to be. And it now is aircraft, naval aviation aircraft carriers that will be the vanguard of the fleet. So in terms of replacing the battleship, my argument is that we will switch to more of an aviation-based and carrier-based aircraft as the vanguard of the fleet. But currently, here in the 20th and 21st century, I would say our submarines, our nuclear-powered submarines, are the ships that will replace quote-unquote battleships.
Great. Did you have any involvement in the Battleship movie? Did you like it? Was it something that you did? Was realistic?
We had quite some involvement with that film. I will say, and I will say this as best I can, if the United States and the world is ever attacked by giant robot aliens that live in the water, you've got a battleship. It's right here. But did I enjoy it? I thought it was a fun movie. I thought it was, knowing that it is not at all accurate, especially the power slide in the water where they'd bring the guns around.
What do you mean?
Rip the bow plane off. Of course, we can't really do that. But I will say that it generated tremendous interest for our ship. And there is one scene in particular that always gets me choked up is you'll see, this battered and bruised destroyer crew come aboard. And the Japanese Captain Nagata looks over at the American and says, "What do you want us to do, Hopper? We don't have any ships left." And they're in their little rubber boat, and they look up and they see the back end of the Missouri, and it says Missouri on it. And Hopper looks over at him and says, "We've got a battleship." And when they get up on board, the old salts, these old actual crew members from the Battleship Missouri in her old sailing days, they come walking down the starboard side and says, "What do you need, son?" And they set to work to bring the battleship to life. And, as someone who works there day in and day out, that's really what we try to do. What those old sailors did in that movie to bring the battleship to life is what we try to do every day on board when we're able. So that really, it's a real heartwarming scene for me in that film.
Nice. Was anybody from the 442nd present at the Missouri surrender signing?
Not from the 442. From the Military Intelligence Service, yes. And those guys were, they were Japanese Americans. Some of them had served prior in the 442, but not actual currently serving soldiers in the 442 were there. They had been previously, perhaps, but then had been reassigned to the Military Intelligence Service.
Nice. A couple people have asked this, Neil. So inquiring minds need to know, are you related to Admiral Yamamoto?
I am not. As far as I know, as far as my family's lineage and history has gone, I am not related to Admiral Yamamoto. But what is interesting is that his family and my family ancestrally are from the same prefecture in Japan. But Yamamoto like Smith in Japan, so.
Oh, good to know.
A lot of us.
Were there any sailors who served on both commissionings of the Missouri? And there's a second part to this question. And was the Missouri the flagship for any Navy admirals?
Okay, so first question one is, was anybody there for the initial commissioning and for the second commissioning? That answer is no, because initial commissioning for us was in 1944, and then our second commissioning was in 1986. So that would have been 40 years of service. We did, however, have some of them who were there for the decommissioning in 55 and were brought back in 86. They were now senior enlisted, type of sailors who had been, fresh out of boot camp type sailors in 55, and then had advanced through the ranks from 55 to 86 and were closing out their careers recommissioning the Battleship Missouri. As far as was the ship a flagship for any naval admirals, yes, it was. It was the flagship of the Third Fleet, and Third Fleet was Bull Halsey. So it was that was Battleship Missouri was in fact Halsey's flagship.
Give us a second.
In World War II.
Neil, can you go ahead and repeat that one more time? We had a little bit of a technical difficulties and loss of the back end of that question. It's okay. It happens.
Hold on. So as I said, the back end of that question, the ship was in fact a flagship for Bull Halsey's Third Fleet.
Oh no.
World War II. So
Perfect.
Battleship US Third.
Again, folks, we're having a little technical delay with Neil tonight.
Hold on.
Neil, I'm going to go ahead and suggest we turn your camera
Hello?
off for now,
Okay.
because sometimes that will help with the process.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you okay. Thanks, folks, and
Okay.
for sticking in there with us.
Thank you, guys.
Can you remind us, what was the title of the book, the Japanese palace aide who spoke? He wrote the book we were talking about at the surrender ceremony?
Yeah, his name was Toshikazu Kase, Kase. He's the author. And the title of the book was Journey to the Missouri.
Journey to Missouri. It sounds really interesting. I'm going to have to pick up that book as well. Where do the signed surrender documents reside today? That's a great question.
So the American copy is actually at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, the satellite office. And the Japanese copy, interestingly enough, when we actually got them, the originals, to make photostatic copies, we had to call the Ministry of the Interior in Tokyo. They found it. It was rolled up in a poster tube stuck in a drawer somewhere in the Ministry of the Interior in Tokyo. It's a classic case of to the victor go the spoils, and the Japanese really didn't want to remember it all that much. So
interesting. This is a really interesting question too. Why was the Missouri chosen for the signing rather than the New Jersey?
Well, remember who was president at the time?
Oh, yeah, Truman.
President at the time was Harry Truman from the great state of Missouri.
Yeah.
And he truly did consider Battleship Missouri to be his ship. And so that was the real reason, one of, I suppose, the reasons that he chose Missouri to be the site of surrender.
Interesting. We do have a lot of questions tonight, everybody. So do know that I will get to as many of these as possible. If for some reason I don't get to your question, know that I am keeping them in mind, and we'll contact Neil and hopefully we'll get some answers to you. Another really great question is, can we take tours of the Missouri now?
Right now,
well, not right now, and none of us can get to Hawaii, but in the future, when we get to Hawaii.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. When you get to when all of this craziness goes away and tourism is back open, absolutely, we're open from 8 to 4 Monday every day except for Christmas, New Year's, and Thanksgiving. And if you do come out, please, please look me up and say, hey, I attended a thing with Neil Yamamoto. I'd be more than honored to personally take you on tour if that does happen.
Exciting. Are the retired United States Navy chiefs still maintaining those teak decks?
There are some retired senior and master chiefs that are involved with our engineering and deck departments on board, and they still do a great job. Most of our folks, though, are volunteer. We do get some active duty naval chiefs that come in and support us and maintain the decks of the ship, the teak decks. And I will say that when they do come aboard, the reverence is incredible that they have for the ship and for her history. And what we do is after they've done their work, we give them a small piece of the teak. With certain groups, we're able to do that. We give them a small piece of the teak, and it is a treasured keepsake for many of them.
Absolutely. Do you have an idea, Neil, how many casualties occurred aboard the USS Missouri during World War II?
Would you believe me if I said 0?
I will, because I trust you.
I appreciate that. But yes, the answer to that is 0. As far as American casualties, there are 0 American casualties on board.
Interesting.
We did have one in the Korean War, and it was not the way you think. Did not die in combat. It was actually our captain, Captain Warner Edsel, 1953. He was navigating the ship back to the port city of Sasebo in Japan, suffered a massive heart attack on the bridge and passed. But that's the only American casualty on the decks of Missouri that we are aware of.
Interesting. This is actually a really interesting question as well. So this guest noticed that when they're looking at the profile of the USS Missouri, it's very graceful, far more graceful than some of those British battleships that look like, bulldogs. But with a profile that low to the water, going after the bow, did the Missouri ever have any problems in high seas?
She did not, not to the point of sinking or taking tremendous damage, but there is a great photograph of the ship in high seas, and you'll see what they call green water, which is that spray. It'll go all the way up to the bridge. So in high seas, any ship would take that kind of damage, or not damage, but that kind of trouble. But again, with her draft, her speed, and her maneuverability, she was able to cut through the water a lot better than, say, those dreadnought type of battleships that were just wide and hulking, because when you cut through the water that way, you tend to push it away a lot better. Okay. So you wouldn't get as much of the, I guess the best word I can use is backsplash from cutting through high seas.
Sure. This guest their grandson would like to know if the Missouri ever sailed with the Enterprise.
No, I don't think we ever did. I'll have to check on that one, but I'll get back to you for sure. But off the top of my head, I can say probably not.
We'll try and figure that out. And I do have information on everybody who submits questions. So we'll do our best to get back to you if we get a good answer on that.
Sure.
So we talked about a little bit about the USS Missouri. Can you tell us what was the status of the other two ships it served alongside? Where are they now?
The other two ships, meaning the other ships of the Iowa class?
Yes.
Okay, so there were four Iowas: Iowa, New Jersey, Wisconsin, and Missouri. Iowa is in San Pedro, California. Missouri, of course, in Honolulu. New Jersey is in Camden, New Jersey. And Wisconsin is in Norfolk, Virginia. All four of the class are all museum ships, and it's the only full class of battleship that's been so preserved.
Which is, Neil and I were talking ahead of time. I vacationed a lot in Norfolk growing up, so I have visited the Wisconsin before. Were parts of the movie Under Siege actually filmed on the Big Mo?
Yes, they were. The underway sequences where you see overhead shots of the ship, that's actually us. Remember, at the time, we were still an active duty warship, but the interior spaces, where you see she's popping out of the cake and all of that stuff, those were either filmed on soundstage or were actually filmed on USS Alabama, which is the class before us. Had pretty much the same profile, pretty much the same guns. They're a little bit shorter. They were 16-inch 45s versus 16-inch 50s like ours. And to the untrained eye, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference, to be completely honest.
Interesting. Did the invasion of Japan did that involve the USS Missouri?
As far as we know, yes, because we were already in the area. So we were softening up the targets already. During the Home Islands campaign, we were already softening up targets. So it stands to reason that we would have been used as part of the invasion force. Now, that invasion force was going to be the largest that the world had ever seen. They were saying something in the neighborhood of 20 Army divisions across the Allies and Americans, 20 Army divisions to invade the Japanese home islands, and about 1 million casualties on the first day.
Wow. Okay, so you will have to forgive me, Neil. I will say that battleships are not my forte, so I apologize if I pronounce this incorrectly. This guest wants to know, and this is your opinion, Neil, USS Missouri versus the Yamamoto. Yamato? Thank you. Which one wins?
Okay.
You've been asked this before, clearly.
I have been. I have quite a opinion on this.
I have tea. Let's go. I'm ready. Which one wins, Neil?
So this is gonna sound like a cop-out, but it's the truth. The one that gets the first shot.
Ooh.
The one that gets the first direct hit. And here's the reason. Missouri had 16-inch guns and 16 inches of armor. Yamato had 18.1-inch guns and 14 inches of armor, which means that if the Missouri were to fire off first and actually get a direct hit on the Yamato, she'd be able to cut through that armor and sink her quick. The Yamato the same way. However, the thing that really tips the scale in favor of the Missouri is her maneuverability, her speed, and the advancement of her radar. She'd be able to see the Yamato before the Yamato ever saw her. So the likelihood is that the Missouri would be able to get off that first shot.
Interesting. Well, now I have to go go read some more about that now. Neil, I do have a couple questions here. We're going to kind of pivot just a little bit. Some guests have some questions about the 442nd. So where does their motto, "Go for broke," come from?
Okay, "Go for broke" comes from Pidgin English here in Hawaii. Most of the boys that served in the 442 were local boys in Hawaii. And the term "go for broke" was a gambler's term. And it meant to shoot the works, give everything you had, bet the farm, go for broke. And, and it was one of those things that in combat, they would shout it. They would shout, "Go for broke," which rallied their boys to muster all their courage, all their strength, and shoot the works, give everything they had to achieve the goal. And that's really where it comes from.
Great. I'm excited that people are excited to learn more about the 442, and hopefully we can share more with our guests in the future too. This guest would like to know, how were Japanese soldiers treated that served in the U.S. military when they returned home?
Well, when they returned home, and I can only speak to what happened here in Hawaii.
Please.
Really, it was not nearly as bad as it was on the mainland. Here in Hawaii, they were welcomed home as heroes, at first, and then as time went on, there were banks that would not give them loans. There were businesses they could not start. So they decided, and this is the truth of it, a couple of our World War II, what they call AJA veterans, the Americans Japanese Ancestry veterans, one man named Sakai Takahashi, he saw that he couldn't get a business loan. He couldn't get a bank loan. So he formed his own bank called Central Pacific Bank, and it's one of the largest banks in Hawaii now. So there was tremendous discrimination. There was not tremendous, but I'll say there was some here in Hawaii. Much more so on the mainland. So much so that as our soldiers came back home and their families released from the internment camps, there were signs in certain neighborhoods that said, and pardon my language, please, this is what was written. It was "Japs keep moving." So it's also very similar for men of the Tuskegee Airmen. It was similar for the 92nd Division, the Buffalo Soldiers. And pretty much any minority soldier in World War II would have encountered similar racism upon return home.
Interesting. Well, again, we will hopefully be sharing more about that in a future presentation. I will say we are not going to be able to get to all of our questions this evening. They keep coming in. I apologize to any of whose questions I don't get to. We're going to ask, I think we have time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. If I don't get to your question in your invitation for this evening, please send me an email with your question. I'm more than happy to share that question with Neil, and we'll get you an answer as soon as we're able. I do have some guests who are curious about who is maintaining the USS Missouri now, and we talked a little bit about this, Neil. Can you share with me who are the caretakers of the USS Missouri and the Arizona today?
Okay, so the USS Missouri is currently being taken care of by the USS Missouri Memorial Association. It is a nonprofit 501c3 based in Honolulu. And we are, as I say, we are a private nonprofit organization. We get no federal funding to maintain the ship. We are a tenant on Ford Island, an active duty naval base. But again, as far as the annual costs to preserve and maintain the ship, all of that comes from donations, grants, non-governmental funding.
Interesting. How far in distance could a projectile from a 16-inch gun go?
26 miles.
26 miles. It's pretty
26 miles with pinpoint accuracy. So
Wow.
we shot over the horizon and hit the target we wanted to hit.
And then I had, how difficult was it to maintain the structural integrity of the hull?
That has been a challenge since day one. If anybody owns a boat, you know how hard that is to maintain your boats. For us, we actually were fortunate enough because we were in a good financial situation in 2009. We were able to actually take the ship out of necessity more than anything and put it into dry dock and patch the holes. And that cost was about $18 million for about a 2-month dry docking period. And we're gonna have to do that again in about 5 or 6 years, just because of the nature of having a steel ship sitting in salt water. So it is a very, very difficult process, but we are doing the things that we can to help mitigate rust and, you know, preserve the condition of the hull as it is now. Because right now she's still floating, she's not taking on much water. We have something called the cathodic rust inhibitor, which basically sends a low-level electrical charge through the hull to basically shake off any forming rust. So we get with things like that we're able to do.
All right. This is a great one to kind of help wrap up our evening, but are there any virtual tours or any offerings from the USS Missouri that our guests can head over to you guys to go learn more?
Absolutely. Go to our website, ussmissouri.org, and we have virtual tours there. You can contact our education department, of which I'm a part, to conduct virtual tours for your families, for your children's school groups, your scout groups, whatever it might be. We would be more than honored to do that.
Excellent.
And again, in the times such that they are, it's really the only way for you to really get an idea of being there with us, and this is the best way we can do that.
Excellent. And this is going to be our last question for the evening. And I'm going to go ahead and let you kind of tell this story. A couple guests have asked this. I think it's a good way to wrap up our night. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got your job at the USS Missouri and a little bit about your family's service in World War II and your father's service in Vietnam?
Okay. I'm going to turn if I can.
Yeah, please turn it back on. I think we're good now.
So I actually started as a teacher. I was a math and science teacher here in Hawaii. I went to school in Colorado.
Neil, we're having some technical difficulties again. You may want to turn your screen off.
Here and realized that wasn't. Oh, I'm sorry.
It happens sometimes.
Okay, sorry about that. Are we better here?
It's okay.
Yeah, are we here?
I can hear you okay.
Okay. So as I said, I was a math and science teacher for 3 years here in Hawaii, and realized, you know what, this wasn't for me. And so remember I told you, hold on. Remember I told you that when the ship had come in, my father and I were sitting on the beach watching it. And I said, Dad, someday I'm going to tell the story of the Battleship Missouri. And here we were, 2007. And my dad telling me, you got to do something, son. And so I joked with him and I said, hey, Dad, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and put in my application at the Battleship Missouri. And he reminded me again that the Battleship Missouri is a Navy ship. And but I did, and I ended up getting the job as a tour guide at first, and then as a supervisor, and then ultimately becoming what I am now. And I had the opportunity to take my dad on a tour of the ship, kind of like what we did here, and going on board and things. And as we left, he kind of let out a sigh and said, I spent 42 years in the Army, and my son's becoming a Navy man. And we had a good laugh about it, but over the years, my dad has really come around, and he's probably one of the staunchest Army supporters of the Battleship Missouri. And he sees it as one team, one fight, that we're able to be able to share this story of World War II with the world. You know, something that he is very proud of and something I'm very, very proud of. My father is a Vietnam veteran. He was there in Vietnam in 1969 as a field artilleryman with the 11th Field Artillery. My grandfather was a 442 veteran serving in Italy. My other grandfather was a truck driver at Fort Lewis in Washington. My great grandfather was a soldier in the Hawaiian Division in World War I. And so, you know, my family has a long lineage of service to this country. And while I never joined the Navy, while I was not a veteran, I cannot claim veteran status. You know, I like to think that me sharing the story and sharing the history, keeping that history alive is my way of giving back to the greatest generation and giving back to my father, my grandfathers, my uncles, who all were part of that greatest generation. And so, you know, I take my job very seriously. And I saw in one of the Q&As, I said, how'd I end up getting my dream job? It truly is my dream job. I am living the dream. You know, I never thought that I would be a museum educator. I never thought that I would be telling the history of the last battleship in the world. And to say that it's been fun for the past 13 years is the understatement of the century. I mean, I love it. I cannot stress to you enough how much an honor it is to be able to share this with folks like yourselves who are so passionate about history. And it really is an honor. It really has been a pleasure and a privilege for me to be here.
We're so excited to have you. And again, just a lot of the comments this evening have been thanking you for this wonderful presentation, thanking you and your family for their service. So again, Neil, we want to thank you and give you a big round of applause. Before I send anybody away this evening, I do want to remind you of our next Date with History, which is going to be Thursday, October 8th at 7 p.m. We're going to be welcoming Dr. Fields Black. She is going to be telling us about Harriet Tubman and the Combahee River Raid. So we are all familiar with Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, but she's going to be sharing with us the first ever original research that she's done about Tubman's work with the U.S. Army Department of the South, specifically with the Combahee River Raid, which I don't want to give too much away of her presentation, but freed over 700 enslaved persons. So that's going to be a wonderful presentation again on Thursday, October 8th at 7 p.m. And we hope you'll join us for that one. Again, if I didn't get to your question this evening, please, in your invitation to tonight's presentation is my email address. Please email me. I'm happy to share your question with Neil, and we'll get you an answer as soon as possible. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for another Date with History. Have a lovely evening and a lovely weekend, and we'll see you in October, hopefully. Have a good night, everybody.
Aloha, folks. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure and such an honor.
All right. Aloha, Neil. Thank you so much. Neil, a couple of guests are saying mahalo.
Yep. Mahalo to you as well, guys. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.